The project for this class is to make your own sketchbook or journal using the Coptic binding technique. You can make yourself the best sketchbook with your favorite paper. It's really what got me into doing a lot of bookmaking. Like I love, like I said in the introduction, how this structure lays perfectly flat, so it makes it really nice for like drawing in. You can make your very own unique kind of sketchbook or journal. You can use, I usually use blank paper because I'm making sketchbooks, but you can also find lined paper or graph paper if you prefer something for writing. It's also great if you like to use a mixture of different types of paper, so you can make really like the most personalized blank book that you can think of. It can be very specific to what you need it to be. We're going to be able to make books with 3 different types of covers. So we're going to go over how to make a Coptic bound book with sort of like handmade hardcovers. So we start with board, and then we're going to cover that board with either paper or book cloth. So that's kind of like your typical like hardcover sketchbook. And then we'll also go over making one with soft covers. So we're just going to use a heavy duty paper for that. And then we'll go over how to make covers using some kind of a found object. So you can use any kind of object that's sort of on the flat side. So like this book I made using like Lego pieces, but you could also use a lot of different types of materials as long as you can find 2 things that are about the same size and they're like more or less flat. So let's talk about the types of materials that we're going to need. So first, decide if you want to make a book with the sort of traditional hardcover that we were talking about, or if you want to use like found objects or a soft cover. So if you wanted to make a book with found object covers, you know, again, find your found objects, and they should be again flat, the same size. So I have 2 Lego base plates. Other really great things to use are just like pieces of like thin wood, even like the covers of an old hardcover book that's maybe falling apart or that you found in like the discount bin at a used bookstore. You could use old postcards. You can, you know, get super creative with the found object thing. If you want to make a soft cover book, you just need 2 pieces of something that's a heavy duty paper. So I'm using these 2 cyanotype prints that I made, and they're on like watercolor paper, so it's like pretty sturdy. If you want to do a traditional hardcover, then you're going to need 2 pieces of binder's board. This is sometimes also called Davy board. So I have 2 pieces of that. It's going to come in a big sheet probably, so you can get the big sheet. We'll go over how to cut that down to size later on when we get into making the covers. So these are 2 pieces that I've already cut. For covering those boards, you're going to need 2 pieces of either a book cloth or some kind of paper. So if you're using a paper covering, you want it to just be a lightweight paper that'll easily fold or turn over the edges. If you're using book cloth is like a special type of cloth. It's either going to be backed with paper or it's going to have some kind of like sizing in it that will make it resistant to the moisture of the glue going through it. So this is a book cloth that has like a sizing in it. If you use plain fabric, then the glue is going to soak through and you're going to see those glue marks. So just kind of be aware of that. But you can also use like a decorative paper, like a patterned paper or a solid colored paper, as long as it's lightweight enough to fold over the edges of the board. And then for the hardcover option, you'll also need just some paper that's going to cover the inside of the cover after we wrap it with the book cloth. So I just have 2 pieces of solid color Canson paper. If you're making the hardcover, we're also going to need some glue. So this is the only option where you need glue, but if you want to do a completely non-adhesive binding, then you can choose the soft cover or the found object version. So for glue, I use PVA glue. So sometimes it comes in a bottle like this. That's called pH neutral PVA. I also like to mix it with methyl cellulose. This is pre-mixed, but methyl cellulose will come in like a powder, and then you'll need some kind of brush to apply the glue with. So that's what you'll need for covers. Next, we're gonna need some paper for the interior pages. So this can be any paper that you want, as long as it's easy to fold in half. So you don't wanna choose something that's so stiff that you can't fold it in half. And then again, like with paper, a lot of the time when you buy it from an art supply store, it's gonna come in really large sheets. So we'll talk about how to cut it down, but you want your sheets of paper to be at least 2 times the width of your finished book size, since we're going to cut these down a little bit and then we're going to fold them in half to make our pages. So just make sure it's at least twice the width of the size that you want your book to be. And now for sewing, you're going to need at least 2 yards of thread. So I have some bookbinding thread. I have this bookbinding thread that's waxed bookbinding thread, which I really like to use for Coptic binding because the waxiness helps the sewing glide a little bit easier. You can also use regular like linen bookbinding thread. This comes unwaxed. So I really like this thread as well, but since it comes unwaxed for Coptic, I usually will wax it a little bit. And so for that, I just use a piece of beeswax. If you don't have bookbinding thread, there's lots of other threads you can use. So I also use sometimes this type of thread that's kind of made for leather working. So that's a really good option too. If you're really in a pinch, you can use a heavy dental floss. So this does like really thick dental floss, and this comes waxed. So it actually would work great for Coptic binding. So you can use something like that. Any heavy duty thread, I would just suggest like not using regular sewing thread because it's usually too thin and it will end up breaking and just being very frustrating to sew with. And then of course we're going to need a needle, and so you can choose like the type of needle that would work best with your thread. These are pretty typical bookbinding needles. So they're straight needles that, you know, are just like a thick sewing needle. The eye is like kind of on the bigger side. And then I also have a curved needle, and curved needles are great for Coptic binding because there's a lot of looping involved. So if you have a curved needle, it's gonna just help make some of the sewing a little bit easier, but you can totally work with a straight needle as well. And next, you're gonna need some kind of folding tool. So I have bone folders, which are great like bookbinding tools for folding and helping us to make sharper creases in our paper. If you don't have a bone folder, you can also use like a non-serrated butter knife. These work great too. So we're just looking for something that has like a long flat surface that we're going to be able to sort of like press along a fold like that. So anything that's in a similar shape to this. And then we're going to need some tools for punching holes in our pages and our covers. So I usually use a light duty awl for punching holes in my pages. The thickness of this is pretty much the same as the sewing needle. So if you don't have an awl like this, you can just use your straight sewing needle for punching holes. You know, an awl is basically a tool that's made to punch holes. So that's what you need. And then for punching holes in the cover, depending on the covering material, you might need a heavy duty awl and a hammer. So just like a regular hammer or like a mallet. The heavy duty awl I like to use for punching holes in like the hardcover that we'll make with the board. But if you're doing like a soft cover version, you could probably just use this type of awl too, like the light duty one. If you're using a found object that is like kind of hard, like this, like the Lego plates, or if you're using like wood or some kind of harder object, then you might also need a drill to go through that. So if for like my Lego base plates, I use a drill with a 1/16 or like a 5/32 drill bit. We're gonna need some strips of scrap paper. If you have graph paper, that might be like super helpful, but if not, some plain paper. You'll need either like a triangle or a ruler, like a plain ruler would be fine. I like using a triangle. And then a pencil and an eraser. And then you'll also need an X-Acto blade or a utility knife For cutting through the board, I really like using like a little utility knife like this with a sliding blade. But any other cutting work you can do with a regular X-Acto blade. So those are all the tools that we really need to have. And then some other things that might be nice to have on hand. If you're doing any gluing of covers, then you'll want something heavy. So I usually like using like a heavy book, like my old art history book does the job. For punching holes, again, if you're either punching holes with the heavy duty awl and a hammer, or if you're using like a drill, I always like to have some kind of a board to punch into, so that this gets marked up and not my tabletop. So those are all of the materials. Just a note on like where you can buy a bookbinding material, since sometimes some of these kind of special bookbinding things can be a little tricky to find. I feel like most art supply stores do carry the basics now. If you want to get like bookbinding thread, you might need to order that or go to a bookbinding specialty store. So I recommend either Hollander's or Tallis. Art supply stores sort of like Blick have a lot of bookbinding supplies too, but I find that they're usually a little bit more expensive than if you went to one of the specialty places. And so all of the info on the materials and where you can buy the materials are all on the project page in Skillshare, so you can always check that to see a written out version. All right, let's move on to talking about paper.